The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty compound as Captain Sarah Martinez checked her equipment one last time. Her hands moved with practiced precision, securing each piece of gear while her mind raced through the mission details. The intelligence reports had been clear. 3 hostages held in a heavily fortified building surrounded by armed militants who had already proven they would kill without hesitation. Sarah's team of 8 elite soldiers stood nearby, their faces grim as they studied the satellite images spread across a makeshift table. The building sat in the center of what military strategists called a kill zone, an open area with no cover, surrounded by elevated positions where enemy snipers could pick off anyone who dared to approach. It was a tactical nightmare that had already cost 2 previous rescue attempts their lives. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is suicide," Sergeant Rodriguez whispered, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. He had served under Sarah for 3 years and had never questioned her judgment before. But this mission was different. The building they needed to reach sat 300 meters across completely open ground, with sniper positions covering every possible approach route. The hostages were aid workers who had been captured while delivering medical supplies to a remote village. Dr. Emily Chen, a pediatric surgeon from San Francisco. James Walker, a water engineer from Texas. Maria Santos, a nurse from Colombia. 3 people whose only crime was trying to help others in a war-torn region. They had been held for 6 days, and intelligence suggested their captors were planning to execute them at sunset. Sarah studied the aerial photographs again, tracing possible routes with her finger. Every path led to the same conclusion. Whoever went first would be completely exposed. The enemy had chosen their position perfectly, creating a trap that seemed impossible to overcome. Traditional military tactics called for air support, heavy artillery, or at least smoke cover. But none of those options were available without risking the hostages' lives. The local commander, Colonel Hassan, had already made his position clear. "Captain Martinez, I cannot authorize this mission. My government will not be responsible for sending your team to their deaths. We have tried twice already, and each time we lost good soldiers for nothing." But Sarah knew something the others didn't. 3 months earlier, she had lost her younger brother in a similar situation. Lieutenant Marcus Martinez had been captured while on patrol in Afghanistan. By the time rescue came, it was too late. She had promised herself that no family would go through what hers had experienced. The faces of the hostages' families, whom she had met during the briefing, haunted her thoughts. Her team gathered around as she explained the tactical situation one more time. The building was a 3-story concrete structure with thick walls and small windows. Intelligence indicated the hostages were being held on the 2nd floor, while the militants maintained firing positions on the roof and upper floors. Motion sensors and tripwires surrounded the building, making any surprise approach nearly impossible. "The probability of success using conventional assault tactics is less than 15%, she announced, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "The probability of casualties approaches 100%. Under these circumstances, I cannot order any of you to participate in this mission." Staff Sergeant Thompson, the team's explosives expert, shook his head. "Captain, we've been through worse situations together. But this isn't worse, this is different. This is asking us to walk into crosshairs with no backup plan." The team had earned their reputation through years of successful operations in the most dangerous regions of the world. They had rescued diplomats from embassy sieges, extracted intelligence assets from deep cover, and conducted surgical strikes against high-value targets. But this mission violated every principle of tactical planning they had learned. As the sun climbed higher, Sarah received updates from the surveillance team. The militants were becoming increasingly agitated, and radio intercepts suggested they were preparing for the execution. Time was running out, and traditional military solutions were proving inadequate. She thought about the phone call she had received that morning from Dr. Chen's father. His broken English could barely convey his desperation as he begged her to bring his daughter home. Maria Santos had 2 young children who asked their grandmother every day when Mommy would return. James Walker's wife was 8 months pregnant with their first child. The weight of command had never felt heavier. Sarah had made difficult decisions before, but never one where the stakes were so high and the odds so impossibly stacked against success. Her training had prepared her for combat, for leadership under pressure, for making split-second decisions that could mean life or death. But nothing had prepared her for this moment when every tactical manual said the mission was impossible. She walked to the edge of the compound and looked across the desert toward the target building. The heat waves rising from the sand created a shimmering mirage, making the structure appear to dance in the distance. Somewhere in that building, 3 innocent people were counting down their final hours, unaware that their would-be rescuers were paralyzed by the impossibility of reaching them. The radio crackled with another update from intelligence. The militants had been filmed moving equipment that looked like execution props, wooden posts and video cameras. The deadline wasn't arbitrary. It was part of a propaganda operation designed to send a message to the international community. Sarah's team waited for her decision, knowing that whatever she chose would define not just this mission, but potentially the rest of their careers. The easy choice was to follow protocol, wait for better intelligence, request additional resources, or simply accept that some missions couldn't be completed successfully. The hard choice was to find a way to reach those hostages before sunset. As she stood in the desert heat, watching the target building through her binoculars, Sarah Martinez began to formulate a plan that would require her to abandon everything she had learned about tactical operations. It was a plan so dangerous that asking her team to follow her would be unconscionable, but it might be the only way to bring 3 innocent people home alive. The afternoon briefing room felt like a tomb. Sarah faced her 8-person team, all seasoned veterans who had followed her through countless dangerous missions. Maps covered every surface, marked with red zones indicating sniper positions and probable ambush points. The silence stretched between them as each soldier processed what their captain was proposing. "You want to go alone?" Corporal Williams asked, disbelief evident in her voice. She was the team's communications specialist, someone who had saved their lives multiple times by maintaining contact during complicated operations. "Captain, that's not tactics. That's suicide with extra steps." Sarah had spent 2 hours developing her plan, considering every angle and contingency. The math was brutal but simple. A team approach would result in multiple casualties with minimal chance of success. A single person, moving at the right time with the right equipment, might have a 30% chance of reaching the building undetected. Those weren't good odds, but they were better than anything else they had calculated. The plan relied on several critical factors. First, intelligence had identified a shift change among the militants that occurred every 6 hours. During the transition, there would be approximately 8 minutes when surveillance would be reduced. Second, the building's eastern approach had a slight depression in the ground, barely 18 inches deep, but enough to provide minimal concealment for someone moving in a low crawl. "The hostages are being held in the northwest corner room, on the 2nd floor," Sarah explained, pointing to the building schematics. "Intelligence indicates there are usually 2 guards in the room, with additional fighters positioned throughout the building. The roof has at least 3 sniper positions, and they've established overlapping fields of fire that cover all standard approach routes." Master Sergeant Davis, the team's senior non-commissioned officer, studied the photographs with the intensity of someone who had survived 15 years of combat operations. "Captain, even if you reach the building, then what? You're one person against an unknown number of hostiles in an unfamiliar structure, with civilians to protect." Sarah had considered this problem extensively. Her plan involved using the building's own architecture against the militants. The structure was old, built during the colonial period with thick walls but outdated electrical systems. By accessing the building's power supply and creating a controlled blackout, she could level the playing field significantly. "The thermal imaging shows the building has a backup generator in the basement," she continued. "If I can disable both, the main power and the generator, I create a tactical advantage. They know the building better than I do. But in complete darkness with chaos erupting around them, that advantage diminishes considerably." The team exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They had all served in situations where split-second decisions meant survival or death. They understood calculated risks and acceptable casualties. But what their captain was proposing went beyond risk assessment into something that resembled martyrdom. Sergeant Rodriguez pulled Sarah aside, speaking quietly but urgently. "Ma'am, I've known you since you were a lieutenant. You're thinking about your brother, aren't you? This isn't Afghanistan, and you're not responsible for what happened to Marcus." The mention of her brother's name hit harder than Sarah expected. Marcus had been captured during a routine patrol that went wrong when intelligence failed to identify an enemy stronghold. By the time rescue operations could be organized, the militants had already executed him and posted the video online. Sarah had watched her parents age 10 years in the space of a single phone call. But this situation was different. The intelligence was solid, the timeline was clear, and most importantly, she had the skills and equipment necessary to attempt the rescue. What she lacked was the support of her team, and she couldn't blame them for refusing to participate in what appeared to be a suicide mission. "I need to be clear about something," Sarah announced to the assembled group. "I'm not ordering anyone to participate in this operation. In fact, I'm specifically ordering all of you to remain at this position and maintain radio contact. This will be a solo insertion with the objective of extracting 3 hostages before the deadline." The room erupted in protests. These soldiers had trained together, fought together, and saved each other's lives repeatedly. The idea of their commanding officer undertaking a dangerous mission alone violated every principle of military teamwork they had learned. Staff Sergeant Thompson stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Captain, with all due respect, this is exactly the kind of heroic nonsense that gets people killed for no good reason. You're talking about abandoning sound tactical principles because you feel guilty about something that happened to your brother. That's not leadership. That's emotional decision-making that puts the mission at risk." Sarah felt the sting of his words because they contained an element of truth. Her judgment was being influenced by personal factors, but that didn't necessarily make it wrong. Sometimes personal motivation was exactly what was needed to push beyond the limitations of standard operating procedures. The intelligence officer entered the room carrying updated satellite images. "Captain, we've got new information. The militants have moved additional personnel into the building. Current estimates suggest 12 to 15 fighters, all armed with automatic weapons. They've also installed additional surveillance equipment around the perimeter." The new information made the mission even more dangerous, but it also confirmed something Sarah had suspected. The militants were preparing for a major propaganda event, which meant they would be focused on their production, rather than external security. It was a small advantage, but one that might make the difference between success and failure. As evening approached, Sarah began her final preparations. She selected her equipment carefully: lightweight body armor, suppressed weapons, breaching charges, medical supplies, and communication gear. Everything had to serve multiple purposes because weight and mobility would be critical factors in her survival. The team watched in sullen silence as she prepared, their disapproval evident, but their loyalty preventing them from directly disobeying her orders. They had served together long enough to know that once Sarah Martinez made a decision, arguing was futile. But they also knew the statistical reality of what she was attempting. Colonel Hassan arrived as Sarah completed her equipment. "Check. Captain, I have received new orders from my government. They are authorizing an artillery strike on the building at sunset. It will eliminate the militants, but..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The hostages would die along with their captors. Sarah checked her watch. Sunset was 3 hours away. The artillery option would guarantee the deaths of the 3 people she was trying to save, making her solo mission the only remaining chance for their survival. The pressure of time had just transformed her dangerous plan into the only viable option remaining. Sarah's hands remained steady as she blackened her face with camouflage paint, but her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. 2 hours until sunset. 2 hours until artillery would reduce the building to rubble along with everyone inside it. The weight of 3 lives pressed down on her shoulders as she made final adjustments to her equipment. The surveillance team had identified the guard rotation schedule with precision that came from hours of careful observation. Every 6 hours, the militants changed their positions in a choreographed dance that lasted exactly 8 minutes and 23 seconds. During those crucial minutes, the eastern approach would have minimal coverage from only one sniper position, instead of 3. "Radio check," Corporal Williams said into her headset, her voice tight with worry. "Captain, you'll have continuous communication support. We'll monitor all enemy frequencies and provide real-time intelligence updates. If the situation becomes impossible, we can call for immediate extraction." Sarah nodded, though they both knew extraction from the kill zone would be nearly impossible once she was committed. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifyingly complex in execution. She would time her approach to coincide with the guard change, use the shallow depression to reach the building's eastern wall, then climb to the second floor using equipment she had practiced with countless times, but never under live fire. "Master," Sergeant Davis approached with the latest intelligence update. "Captain, thermal imaging shows the hostages are still in the northwest room. 2 guards remain with them, but the rest of the fighters have spread throughout the building. They're clearly preparing for something, probably the execution video they plan to broadcast." The thought of Dr. Chen, James Walker, and Maria Santos spending their final hours in terror made Sarah's jaw clench with determination. She had memorized their faces, their backgrounds, their families. Dr. Chen had volunteered for this mission because she wanted to perform surgery on children who had no access to medical care. James Walker had been installing water purification systems in remote villages. Maria Santos had been teaching local women basic nursing skills. "Movement in 30 minutes, Sarah announced, checking her watch again. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and she would face the full complement of guards. Too late, and the artillery strike would commence regardless of whether she had reached the hostages. Her team gathered around for final instructions, their faces reflecting a mixture of admiration and frustration. These were soldiers who had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments in the military, but even they recognized that what Sarah was attempting went beyond calculated risk into something approaching madness. "If I don't establish contact within 45 minutes, you are to withdraw to minimum safe distance and allow the artillery mission to proceed," she ordered. "Under no circumstances are any of you to attempt a rescue operation. That's a direct order from your commanding officer." Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression serious. "Captain, we want you to know that we've never served under a better officer. Your decisions have saved lives and completed missions that others said were impossible. We're not questioning your judgment. We're questioning the odds." The surveillance specialist monitoring enemy communications suddenly tensed. "Captain, we're intercepting increased radio traffic from the building. They're discussing timeline acceleration. It sounds like they might be moving the execution up by several hours." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. If the timeline had changed, the artillery strike might not be sufficient to prevent the executions. The hostages could be killed at any moment, making her mission even more urgent and dangerous. She moved to the eastern edge of the compound and studied the terrain one final time through high-powered binoculars. The ground between her position and the target building looked like the surface of an alien planet, flat, rocky, and completely devoid of cover except for the shallow depression that would serve as her only concealment. The building itself appeared deceptively quiet. No movement was visible in the windows, and the militants had positioned themselves carefully to avoid detection. But Sarah knew that behind those walls, at least 12 armed fighters were waiting for any sign of rescue attempt. They had killed the previous rescue teams with methodical efficiency. "Time to move," she whispered into her radio, beginning the low crawl that would either save 3 lives or add her name to the list of casualties this building had already claimed. The first 100 meters were the most dangerous. Sarah moved, like a snake across the rocky ground, using every small stone and depression for concealment. Her breathing remained controlled despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The techniques she had learned in survival training became automatic. Move during the wind gusts that would mask sound, pause when the air was still, never maintain the same rhythm twice. Through her earpiece, she heard Corporal Williams providing updates. No change in enemy positions. Thermal shows guard still in rotation pattern. You're invisible on our scopes, Captain. The halfway point brought her to the shallow depression that intelligence had identified. It was even less substantial than the photographs had indicated, barely deep enough to conceal someone lying completely flat. But it was aligned perfectly with the building's eastern wall, providing a direct route to her objective. Sarah's radio crackled with urgent whispers from the surveillance team. Captain, we're seeing movement in the building. Thermal signatures suggest they're gathering the hostages. This might be happening sooner than we expected. The news sent a surge of desperate energy through her tired muscles. She increased her pace slightly, knowing that speed had to be balanced against stealth. Too fast, and she would make noise that could alert the sentries. Too slow, and she might arrive to find 3 execution videos being broadcast to the world. As she reached the building's eastern wall, Sarah could hear voices speaking in Arabic from somewhere above. The militants were definitely active, and their conversation had the urgency of people preparing for a significant event. She pressed her ear against the concrete and felt the vibrations of footsteps moving throughout the structure. I'm at the wall, she whispered into her radio, beginning vertical ascent. The climbing equipment she had selected was designed for situations exactly like this, lightweight, but strong enough to support her weight plus gear. She had practiced the technique hundreds of times, but never while knowing that discovery would mean immediate death for herself and 3 innocent people. Above her, the second-floor windows were dark, but she could see faint light emanating from the northwest corner where intelligence indicated the hostages were being held. Somewhere in that room, Dr. Chen, James Walker, and Maria Santos were waiting for either rescue or execution, unaware that their fate now depended on one person's ability to climb a wall in silence. Sarah began her ascent, each movement calculated and precise. The concrete offered enough handholds for an experienced climber, but the weight of her equipment made every meter a struggle against gravity and time. Behind her, the sun continued its relentless descent toward the horizon, marking the countdown to an artillery strike that would turn the building into a crater. Sarah's fingertips found the second-floor window ledge just as her radio crackled with terrifying news. Captain, thermal imaging shows significant movement in the northwest room, multiple heat signatures gathering. We think they're preparing for immediate execution. Hanging 15 feet above the ground with only her grip strength keeping her from falling, Sarah felt time compress into a tunnel of desperate focus. Through the window beside her, she could hear muffled voices and what sounded like someone crying. The sound cut through her tactical mindset and struck directly at her heart. One of the hostages was breaking down, perhaps realizing that death was approaching. She pulled herself up onto the narrow ledge and peered through the dusty glass. The room was larger than intelligence had indicated, with concrete pillars that would provide cover but also create blind spots where enemies could hide. In the center of the space, she could see 3 figures sitting on the floor, their hands bound behind their backs. Dr. Emily Chen was immediately recognizable from her intelligence photos, though her usually neat black hair was disheveled and her medical scrubs were torn and dirty. James Walker, the water engineer, sat beside her with blood on his shirt from what appeared to be a beating. Maria Santos, the Colombian nurse, was the one crying. Quiet, desperate sobs that spoke of someone who had abandoned hope. 2 militants stood guard over the hostages, both carrying assault rifles and wearing tactical vests. But Sarah's blood ran cold when she counted additional heat signatures moving through the building. The intelligence estimate of 12 to 15 fighters had been conservative. Thermal imaging now suggested at least 20 hostile personnel throughout the 3 floors. Control, I'm in position at target window, she whispered into her throat mic. Hostage visual confirmed, but enemy strength is significantly higher than estimated. Master Sergeant Davis's voice came through her earpiece, tight with concern. Captain, abort mission. Those odds are impossible. We'll take the artillery strike and hope for the best. But Sarah could see something through the window that the surveillance team couldn't. The militants were setting up video equipment, professional cameras and lighting that suggested this execution was going to be a major propaganda production. They weren't planning to kill the hostages quickly and quietly. They intended to torture them on camera, making their deaths as horrifying as possible for maximum psychological impact. She made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life, regardless of the outcome. "Control, I'm going in. Stand by for signal to call off artillery strike." The window mechanism was older than she had hoped, requiring more force to open than modern hardware would need. Each squeak of metal on metal sounded impossibly loud in the desert silence. Sarah held her breath, waiting for shouts of alarm that would indicate discovery, but the militants inside seemed focused on their preparations. As she slipped through the window into an adjacent room, Sarah could hear more clearly what was happening in the northwest corner. One of the militants was speaking in accented English, apparently rehearsing a speech for the camera. His words made her stomach turn. He was describing in detail how each hostage would die and why their deaths would serve as a warning to anyone who tried to help the local population. The building's layout was exactly as intelligence had described, but the reality of moving through it was far more complex than any blueprint could convey. The floors creaked with age, the walls echoed even small sounds, and the militants had established a communication system that meant any alarm would bring the entire force down on her position within seconds. Sarah moved through the shadows like a ghost, using techniques learned in urban warfare training that had been refined through years of actual combat experience. Her suppressed pistol was ready, but she knew that firing even one shot would alert the entire building. This had to be accomplished with surgical precision or not at all. Through the doorway leading to the northwest room, she could see the two guards more clearly. Both were young men, probably in their early 20s, but they carried their weapons with the confidence of experienced fighters. Between them and the window she had entered was 30 feet of open space with no cover, except the concrete pillars. "Control, I need immediate intelligence on militant positions throughout building," she whispered. "I'm going to create a diversion that will draw them away from hostage location." Corporal Williams' voice was barely audible through the earpiece. "Captain, showing heat signatures on all 3 floors. Roof level has at least 4 personnel, first floor has 6 to 8, and second floor has multiple contacts including your location." The numbers were daunting, but Sarah had faced worse odds before. What made this situation unique was the presence of innocent civilians who could be killed instantly if the operation went wrong. Traditional assault tactics were designed to overwhelm enemy positions with superior firepower, but that approach would almost certainly result in hostage casualties. She reached the building's electrical panel, located in a utility room just as intelligence had predicted. The wiring was old but functional, and she could hear the hum of the backup generator in the basement below. By disabling both power sources simultaneously, she could create the chaos and confusion necessary to level the playing field. The charges she had brought were small, but precisely designed for this type of sabotage. Too much explosive force would damage the building's structure and potentially collapse sections where the hostages were located. Too little would fail to disable the electrical systems completely. She had calculated the exact amount needed based on the building's specifications. As Sarah prepared the charges, her radio brought devastating news. "Captain, enemy communications indicate they're moving up the timeline again. Execution appears imminent, within the next 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Sarah felt the weight of that deadline settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. In 10 minutes, artillery would reduce the building to rubble regardless of whether she had succeeded. In 10 minutes, 3 innocent people would either be free or dead. And in 10 minutes, her own fate would be decided by actions she was about to take. She armed the charges and began moving toward the hostage location, knowing that once she triggered the blackout, there would be no turning back. The building would erupt into chaos. Gunfire would fill the darkness, and somewhere in that confusion, she would have to locate 3 terrified civilians and guide them to safety through a building full of armed militants. Through her earpiece, she could hear her team's voices offering tactical support, weather updates, and countdown information. But Sarah knew that once she entered that northwest room, she would be completely alone. No backup was coming. No rescue was possible if things went wrong. The success or failure of the mission rested entirely on her ability to do what an entire team had deemed impossible. The sound of Dr. Chen's voice reached her through the walls. The pediatric surgeon was speaking calmly to her fellow hostages, trying to comfort them in what they all believed were their final moments. That voice, steady despite the terror, gave Sarah the final surge of determination she needed. She activated the charges and plunged the building into absolute darkness. The building plunged into absolute darkness the moment Sarah triggered the charges. 20 armed militants who had been confidently preparing an execution suddenly found themselves blind and confused in a structure they thought they controlled completely. Shouts erupted from every floor as fighters called out to each other, trying to understand what had happened and regain their tactical advantage. Sarah moved through the chaos with her night vision goggles giving her the only clear sight in the building. The infrared signatures of panicked militants appeared like ghosts as they stumbled through familiar rooms that had suddenly become alien territory. She could hear them crashing into furniture, calling orders in Arabic, and the distinctive sound of weapons being readied for combat. "Control. Blackout successful," she whispered into her throat mic while moving toward the northwest room. Multiple hostiles disoriented, beginning hostage extraction. The 2 guards in the hostage room were shouting questions at each other, their voices high with stress and confusion. Sarah could hear Dr. Chen speaking calmly to her fellow captives, telling them to stay low and remain quiet. Even in this terrifying situation, the surgeon's medical training was helping her maintain composure and potentially save lives. Through her night vision, Sarah could see one of the guards had moved to the window, trying to determine if the power failure was the result of an attack or equipment malfunction. The second guard remained near the hostages, his rifle pointed in their general direction even though he couldn't see them clearly in the darkness. The sound of boots on concrete echoed through the building as militants from other floors began moving to investigate the power failure. Sarah knew she had perhaps 3 minutes before they organized a systematic search that would locate her position. The element of surprise was her only significant advantage, and it was disappearing rapidly. She reached the doorway to the northwest room and assessed the tactical situation with the clinical precision her training had ingrained. Guard 1 was silhouetted against the window, presenting a clear target but positioned where his fall would make noise that could alert others. Guard 2 was closer to the hostages, making any engagement potentially dangerous to the civilians. Sarah made her decision with the split-second timing that separated successful operators from casualties. She entered the room like a shadow, moving behind Guard 2 while he was still trying to peer through the darkness toward the window. Her knife found the precise location that would incapacitate him instantly and silently. Guard 1 heard something and began to turn, but Sarah was already moving. Her suppressed pistol made no more sound than a loud hand clap, and the militant dropped without firing a shot. In less than 10 seconds, she had eliminated both threats and secured the immediate area around the hostages. "Dr. Chen, James, Maria," she whispered urgently. "I'm Captain Martinez, United States Army. I'm here to get you home." The relief in their voices was immediate and overwhelming. Dr. Chen began crying, not the desperate sobs Maria had been producing earlier, but tears of hope and gratitude. James Walker tried to stand but discovered his legs wouldn't support him after days of being kept in restraints. "Can you walk?" Sarah asked while cutting their restraints with tactical efficiency. The plastic zip ties fell away, but she could see that all 3 hostages were weak from poor treatment and inadequate food. "I can manage," Dr. Chen said, rubbing circulation back into her wrists. "Maria is hurt. They beat her yesterday when she tried to help James. And James has been sick. I think he has an infection from an untreated wound." Sarah quickly assessed their physical condition with the medical training all special operations personnel received. Maria had bruised ribs but was ambulatory. James had a fever and moved with obvious pain, but adrenaline would carry him through the escape if necessary. Dr. Chen appeared to be in the best condition despite her ordeal. The building around them was becoming more organized as the militants adapted to the darkness. Sarah could hear systematic movement as they began searching room by room, calling out positions to each other in what was clearly a well-rehearsed emergency procedure. Her advantage was diminishing with each passing second. "We're going out the same window I came through," she explained while helping James to his feet. "It's a 15-foot climb down to the ground, then 300 meters across open terrain to safety. Can you handle that?" Dr. Chen nodded immediately. "I rock climb as a hobby. I can help the others if needed." Maria Santos, despite her injuries, managed a weak smile. "I grew up in Bogota. I've been running from dangerous people my whole life. Just tell me where to go." The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway made Sarah's decision for her. "Move now. Stay low. Stay quiet. And follow exactly where I step." She led them toward the window she had entered through. But the sound of voices from that direction indicated militants had discovered her entry point. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly as enemy forces converged on their location from multiple directions. "Change of plans," Sarah whispered, guiding them toward a different window. "We're going to the southeast corner. It's a harder climb down, but it should be clear." Through her earpiece, Corporal Williams' voice carried urgent information. "Captain, thermal shows multiple hostiles converging on your floor. You've got maybe 90 seconds before they reach your position. 90 seconds to move 3 weakened civilians through a building full of armed militants, then guide them across 300 meters of open ground while under potential sniper fire." The arithmetic of survival was becoming increasingly unfavorable. But Sarah had committed to this course of action and would see it through regardless of the odds. As they reached the southeast window, the sound of discovery echoed through the building. Someone had found the unconscious guards in the northwest room, and shouts of alarm were spreading throughout the structure. The element of surprise was completely gone now, replaced by the desperate urgency of a fighting retreat. Sarah helped Dr. Chen through the window first, knowing the surgeon's climbing experience would make her the most capable of assisting the others. Maria followed, moving with determination despite her injuries. James Walker was struggling, his fever and weakness making every movement an effort. "Control, beginning ground movement with 3 packages, Sarah reported while helping James through the window. "Request immediate extraction support." Master Sergeant Davis's voice carried bad news through her earpiece. "Captain, enemy forces are mobilizing outside the building. You're going to have company on the ground level." As Sarah followed the hostages through the window, she could see muzzle flashes beginning to appear in windows throughout the building. The militants had night vision equipment of their own, and they were beginning to establish overlapping fields of fire that would turn the open ground into a killing field. The race across 300 meters of desert terrain was about to begin, with 3 exhausted civilians, 1 injured operator, and 20 armed militants in pursuit. Sarah checked her ammunition, adjusted her equipment, and prepared for what would either be a successful extraction or a final stand in the desert sand. The first bullet struck the ground beside them as Sarah led the 3 hostages away from the building. Muzzle flashes erupted from windows above like deadly fireworks, and the militants' shouts echoed across the desert as they realized their prisoners were escaping. Dr. Chen stayed close behind Sarah, helping support James Walker, whose fever was making him stumble with each step. "Stay in the depression," Sarah commanded, guiding them toward the shallow channel that had provided her concealment during the approach. "Keep moving no matter what happens." Maria Santos, despite her injuries, was proving to be remarkably resilient. The Colombian nurse had grown up in one of Bogotá's most dangerous neighborhoods, and her survival instincts were sharp. She took James's other arm, and together with Dr. Chen, they half-carried the weakened engineer across the rocky terrain. Through